Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by BCS America.
BCS two-wheel tractors power dozens of professional quality, PTO-driven attachments for soil working, mowing, property maintenance, snow removal, and more. BCS tractors are famous for their durability and versatility, with handlebars that rotate 180 degrees for front and rear mount implements. And now, BCS has introduced a game changer in the two-wheel tractor world. Model 770 with hydrostatic drive. Model 770's Easy Grip lever enables the operator to precisely select ground speed and direction of travel without the need to shift or vary the throttle. This is extremely useful for heavy mowing or snow clearing jobs where constant changes in direction or speed are necessary. Now you can keep the flail mower running at full RPM while you mow forward, reverse, and forward again, all without the need to shift or re-engage the PTO. The hydrostatic Model 770 is on sale now. Check out bcsamerica.com for sale pricing and to find your nearest dealer. That's bcsamerica.com.
Today's show is also brought to you by Growers & Co. One of the most exciting developments in recent years is that, thanks to Jean-Martin Fortier, the market gardener, and his team, there is now a clothing, tool, and apparel company that was built for exactly the type of work we talk about on this show. I know that I've personally grown tired of looking through workwear websites and catalogs built for fishing or carpentry to find what I need for market gardening, so I was thrilled when Growers & Co. came to fruition, and even more thrilled when I tried their clothing. They have done absolutely excellent work. Their clothing is well made and well fitted. The tools are well designed by growers and made to last. There is also a magazine that Growers & Co. is putting out twice per year with a focus on small scale farming. I love the clothes. I rock the Muscovich vest a lot. The shirts, the hats, all of it. Anyway, follow Growers & Co. on Instagram and all the platforms and check out what they have to offer at growers.co. All right. Let's jam. Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 30, season 3. Today is the last episode of season 3, and I wanted to end the season with one of my favorite humans, Kristyn Leach of Namu Farm in Central Valley, California. I feel like after 2020, I needed this conversation, and it goes in all sorts of good, nerdy directions, from talking about an infestation of symphylans to what happened within the seed community through COVID to the negative side of hybrid seeds, and it is not one I ever really thought of. We also discuss collaborations and a whole lot else. It is an amazing conversation and a great way to round out season 3. First, make sure you are following at Collaborative Farming on Instagram. That is a new podcast that will be dropping in a few weeks, hosted by Jackson Roulette. We will make sure to put up an episode on this feed to remind you, but you should also go over there and follow. Also, you may have noticed that we did a lot of northern growers to round out the season, and so for you southern growers, do not fret. Season 4 will be loaded with southern growers, thanks in a large part to a small grant we have received from Southern SARE. Last thing, please make sure to pre-order a copy of my book, The Living Soil Handbook, at notillgrowers.com. When you specifically order it from us, the proceeds go to making more content for you. In this episode with Kristyn, I talk a bit about our business model, and so I hope you'll understand that, I know I push the book and the Patreon thing a lot, but the goal is to find a way to make a reasonable living for me and my team by giving everything we create and everything we gather, all the people, all the conversations that we have, just giving that away for free, no paywalls. But the only way we can achieve that is through donations and grants and the occasional fundraiser like hats sometimes, and right now, a book. Anyway, check that out at notillgrowers.com. All right, enough from me. Let's get into this amazing conversation with Kristyn Leach of Namu Farm. Kristyn Leach, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Jesse.
I'm super excited to have you again. I'm always super excited to chat with you. Okay, so catch us up about the farm. Last time we spoke, you were on 2 acres, I think, in Central Valley on an olive farm. Is that still more or less the case? Any significant changes there?
Yeah, I'm still in the same place in winters, and I am using a little bit more of the open ground just as my landlord is scaling back his his operation. And so I'm probably on maybe about 4 acres now. And yeah, I think, the past 3 seasons here, as you're going to find out, just the challenges of moving a farming operation and, just getting to know a new place, even though it's fairly similar in terms of soil and everything else. But a lot of the past 3 years has just been dealing with challenges, mostly, honestly, around just the sheer concentration of like symphylans that we ended up discovering we had in our soil. So that's been probably the most troubling thing. Like, I think in that first season, just kind of getting my bearings, and maybe like my Catholic upbringing, like equating a lot of my failure with just my own inadequacies and punishment from a higher being. And then in the second season, really, just really noticing that it actually, most of the things that I was seeing the first season were just due to, symphylan infestation, basically. So I had, the first season, like things just seemed rather mysterious and I didn't have any really kind of like fixed control. And I just kept adjusting, trying to figure out what was happening. And the second season, like, was seeing like some really consistent things and just really perplexing in terms of things not growing. And so I did end up just like gridding the whole farm and taking soil samples and pulling up seedlings to just see what was happening, if it was just like a moisture issue or what. And and then just really, I would hold a palm full of soil and see, over a dozen symphylans just kind of on any little plug.
Wow.
And so, I asked around, just asked a lot of farmers, and, I think it was particularly challenging because, I know actually in the no-till forum, there was a thread that people had talked about symphylans in no-till, because I think it's a really relevant thread to explore because a lot of the conventional knowledge is just to till really aggressively, because it breaks up their pathways and it's, just constantly disrupts their vertical movements. And so there was just a real lack of knowledge around how to do it when you're not actually tilling the soil. And just overall kind of like the way that the problem is addressed or the research that is or isn't there just kind of speaks to the fact that it's mostly a problem that affects organic farmers and it's a problem of soil organic matter and things like that. And so, I got really curious. I almost wanted there to be like a middle school style pamphlet of living with symphylans, like, and ways to kind of address it, because to me, like, all the options for eradication were about making your soil uninhabitable. So it just seemed like a strange logic. Sometimes, the things people were suggesting, I was like, okay, so I basically need to make it so that nothing wants to live here. And I would be better off like turning this into a parking lot or something. Because they're like, yeah, soil compaction helps. And like, so soak the soil and then compact it with a roller.
Wow.
So I was like, okay, none of these things are really going to work for me. So I just tried to document a lot, like, for me, I still, because no-till feels like it is more resonant and aligned with like all the other sort of values that I wanted and the way that I wanted my farm to contribute to our ecosystem. It was just about trying to figure out like, if that is like an anchor point and that is what I'm committed to, then how can I tweak other things within it to manage the impacts and minimize the impacts, and then also just try to notice the degree to which different crops are susceptible and the ways that it manifested. So I could see like a lot of my more tender cucurbits and things, like my summer squash rotations and my melons, the impact, basically the symphylans eat the root hairs off of your plants, and so it prevents the roots from creating adequate root pressure and bringing water up, pumping it up to their bodies. And that, with those types of plants, seemingly just like would kill large portions of it. So especially my first round of those successions, I was losing like over 60% of, of that succession. And so it just really threw my planning off. Whereas other crops like my nightshades would get stunted and it would be like 3 weeks in the ground and the plug was like the exact same size. But I'm not sure if it's like the alkaloids those plants produce or something else. But while they stayed stunted, like usually once it gets blazing hot in June and the symphylan pressure decreases because they try to go deeper in the subsoil, then they started to grow and you still saw like a pretty reduced yield, and some plants didn't really fully recover, but you saw them able to kind of grow once the biggest part of the predation was over. So it was just like thinking like that's a valuable resource to just know, because you can affect, at least now going into this season, like I know what I should just not bother trying to get as like that early summer succession and just wait and put out plants later, so that the past couple of years just have burned through so much of my stock seed and things like that, just because losing that early, spring, summer bridge succession of, summer squash and things, just made me have to replant and just try to keep compensating and trying to get in as early as possible. But it was just such a dramatic reduction. And so that affects like how much of the plants can be set aside for seed and things like that. So there are some pretty significant setbacks. And it also is just, I think everyone out there can relate to, one, how taxing it is. Like transplant and planting season is just really brutal in terms of just how you're budgeting like your physical energy and your mental stamina. So being in that mode of putting out like 8,000 plants in a day, and then within 4 or 5 days, watching 50% of them die just rather immediately, just like really took its toll mentally, because it just felt really sad. And it just was that constant recalculating of, okay, well, how am I going to make this back, both just production wise, seed wise, like economically. So I think it definitely, it took a lot out of me. And my partner now has coined the term May meltdown, because I think over the last, in the course of like over 10 years of having my own farm now, she notices a lot more like these consistent patterns of like, every May you get really like fatalistic about everything. It goes to a dark place and you act like you've never experienced it before, which is like, it's actually an annual thing. Like it's like clockwork. Like May comes and you just start, just being really hard on yourself and thinking that everything is a failure. And so I try to stay ahead of that, but it just sort of happens, I guess. But symphylans, I think that no-till, I still am convinced it's the right strategy for it, just based on trying to understand the nature of those little critters who, are fairly evil in my book. But, just the notion that if there's more decaying root matter, different forms of like carbon pools and things like left in the soil, that there would just be more food sources. And so I think that it can ultimately dilute the impact on your young plants. Whereas, 2 years ago, I did end up through a large portion of my field just to have some sort of, to get a better sense of what was going on. I did actually just like disc and kind of rototill the top portion of my soil just to kind of set a tone of like what was happening. I did kind of the management style of what my landlord, how he has treated the soil, to kind of just see if I could understand some sort of controlled variable. And I do think that, last year returning and experimenting with like more my style of farming, I could see like a little bit of positive change. But I really do think that no-till and like people who are using these farming practices could have something very useful to contribute to something that yeah, can be a really devastating problem on a farm. Like I'm close to UC Davis, and so I like get to pick their brains a lot. And basically when I told them the concentration of how many symphylans I was seeing, like in any given space, they're like, "Oh, that's what we would consider like an infestation." And when we see that in any of our experimental plots, we just abandon it. So I'm like, okay, well, I don't really have that option. So, yeah.
Wow. Do the symphylans have natural predators? I mean, are they, like moles and voles and that sort of thing? Did they consume symphylans?
That would be amazing because it would make I would never see the day where I'd be happy for all the gophers and voles that we have at the farm. So it would be a real kind of moment of reconciliation, I suppose. But I think things like, millipedes and things can be predators. I think certain kinds of nematodes can be. And so, yeah, I think that was the other part. From what I've heard and read, that, because that would be my natural inclination, and like, oh, think about the broader sort of food chain. But I think that it may not be enough to like really rebalance it so much as, maybe just having more food sources, more variety of food sources for them. Because I even tried planting more cover crops in between rows and irrigated summer cover crops, in the hopes that it would just dilute the impact per plant. And even like direct seeded things just really I was not getting good germination or seeing any good progress with that. So that strategy didn't even really work. But I will definitely keep you posted. And I'm hoping that just slowly, I think it is just the big question of just, I think like lots of things when it comes to sort of these types of regenerative farming practices and what people want to see is how you sit with what you know in your heart to be the best for the long term and the best for the most kinds of species. And then the reality of when your livelihood is being a farmer, like how do you reconcile that with just the sort of economic pressure to just stay afloat. So I think that's just been in the past couple of years has pointed out to me just what type of organizing needs to happen or how to convey that to people, that if we want to bridging that gap of just the need for short-term success, because most farmers are really living kind of check to check. And with long-term investment, like I think for farmers to succeed, like there needs to be more collective shouldering of that risk and that burden to just help make decisions that sacrifice short-term yields for the sake of knowing that in the long term, you'll encounter this problem less if you're able to just sort of absorb and have a runway for some failure in the beginning. And I think that's the same with lots of the type of plant breeding that you want to see happening on farms and things like that, is just freedom to fail in the immediate, knowing that then we won't be on that sort of hamster wheel, Groundhog's Day reality of each year kind of contending with the same redundant problems, or small farms dealing with all of these sort of duplicative problems in their own little silos. So definitely been trying to give that some thought and thinking just what type of bigger, either policy or kind of collective organizing efforts there can be, because when you just like experience like a really acute problem, and I think that's happening more and more because of all this chaos. Just starting to think, if anything in this last year has, I think, shown all of us, is just trying to think about how to be really aspirational, like watching like these sort of systemic failures in all these regards, hopefully encouraging more people to think about how we band together to kind of weather this.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny you mentioned the May meltdown, and every year around May, I go through a similar thing, but it's it's like the may wish to collaborate. Like that's when I'm like, I have too many decisions to be made right now. You know, I have a shortage of cash flow or whatever because markets just started and it's, you know, it's not like the height of the summer. And yeah, I'm just like, I just need more people who have like a vested interest. And this is kind of like, you know, in the summer, we're going to be doing a collaborative farming series of podcasts. Jackson, my partner, No Till Growers, is doing it. And that's partially because he and I always call each other in the middle of like May. And we're like, okay, so how do we just join forces? Because this is just completely bonkers. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the you know, sharing that burden, or like there's sort of models for that out in Germany and probably in other places in Europe. But I remember talking to Felix Hofmann about how he has basically like a membership to their farm, and it doesn't mean you get anything necessarily. Like you may get the overflow, but people kind of just like pay to be a part of the farm. And I've thought, you know, sorry, I'm going to talk for a second, but I think it kind of relates to what you were saying, is the way that we run No-Till Growers is our whole kind of mantra is like, how do we give more stuff away? Like, how do we get paid to give stuff away? And so we've got all these other funding sources like Patreon, and we're looking at grants and those sorts of things. And we're always trying to think like, how can we do more and then give it away? And I'm like, could this be a model for farms? Like farms have like a Patreon, farms have, you know, these other sort of, you know, more people working on getting them grants to just do what they do. And I don't think it's an absolute necessity, but in those first few years, I think that could be so helpful for young farmers when they're short on cash flow and capital anyway.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And just, I mean, I love that idea, like someone, you know, a friend and person who I work with, had said, like, you know, you should have a CSA where sometimes maybe people don't get boxes, and that's okay. And it sort of like appalled me, and it like pointed out like how much, you know, just sort of as a sort of anti-capitalist person, like it surprised me to notice like, oh, I can't do that, you know, like still equating to like the value of what I'm producing. They're like, yeah, there needs to be more CSAs where maybe you get food and maybe you don't. And it just like cracked me up. I mean, essentially, like, I think that I can notice ways that like, yeah, I have such just like an incredible community around me that whether they're like really paying for something like that, like there's just ways that I feel supported beyond what the farm actually produces, and like the farm functions as like this space that people feel really collectively invested in. Like I think people really think of it as their farm in this way, and I think that's ultimately the thing that, you know, really does bring me the most satisfaction and joy at the end of the day, is to just know like people come out there, and yeah, like to them, there's so much value in just spending the day getting to like see these crops and reconnect with plants that are significant to them. And that, yeah, there's many times that they just like never expect to like necessarily go home with it, but it is like nourishing in this other way. And I think that, so many farms, like that's like what would feel so fulfilling, is to just have that sense of placemaking, and non sort of just transactional approaches to like who's interested in your farm. So I think, yeah, it's really exciting that you all are going to have some of those conversations around just, just kind of more cooperative models and things. And just to be really creative and imaginative with it, you know, like I think people can get really wrapped up in, sort of the cooperative models that exist, or get really down on like whether they've seen like really substantive, successful, farming co-ops and things. And I just think, you know, why not just try? Right. Like it's not like everything's working so well for us right now. So the reluctance to just even, to just try, I think is just because sometimes like the failure and the risk associated with it can be so devastating. And so, I'm just interested in thinking about ways like just trying to, have conversation with people outside of even the farming community to understand, it's great, shop local, do your thing, go to the farmer's market, but like, you should be deepening some of these relationships. And the most touching thing to me is the amount of people that just, reach out to make sure things are okay. And like the pandemic really was so scary. And at the same time, it was like so heartening because just getting so many people that, beyond just like my actual friends, like just it pointed out like how many people have just clustered around the farm for the farm's sake. And just like felt really invested in making sure that the farm was going to survive all of this and was going to be okay. And so just people, whether that's like, oh, is your truck okay? Like, do you need to take it to the mechanic? Do you need like help with something? Or just, bringing food to make sure it was like, we just weren't eating instant ramen all year and things like that. Just the sort of the type of care that can be expressed, and to think of farms as being really central and and just fostering that care that then can connect people within their communities is, I feel like, feels very exciting to think that to continue to build on that.
Yeah. And it's kind of striking me now thinking about like farmland is being gobbled up right now. Like it's just people want, a more significant amount of people really want to own some land and possibly, having walked into grocery stores last year and seen bare shelves, they want some control of their food. And I'm wondering if, like there's not opportunity there for farmers to say like, buy a share in our farm essentially, or like become a member of our farm. And that, sort of helps to sustain not only what we're doing, but offer you the opportunity to have food. So it's like a CSA, but it's just like you're supporting a farm so that you don't have to have that worry as much, that that's kind of keeping us afloat and letting us grow and those sorts of things. Like, I don't know. I mean, I think there's some potential there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I do think, like what you're saying in California, it's like land access has always been so, really inaccessible in a debilitating way because it's just so expensive. And, when I first moved here, I remember talking to an older farmer, and he, chatting for a while, asking me where I'm coming from. And they're like, all right, look, you've got like a lot of experience, but because you've just been a farmhand, you probably don't have any money. And I'm like, yeah, that's correct. I'm like, okay, what you're going to have to do living in California is you're going to just like find someone who probably works in some other industry, probably tech, and they're going to have bought a hobby farm because they like the idea of living rural. And, everybody has this idea of having this like illustrious, beautiful garden, and they're going to realize it's hard work, and they're going to realize they don't have any experience in it. And then they'll probably lease the land to you. And he just sort of like laid out this whole thing. And that's been very accurate, like to just see the divide of who's able to own land or who has had land to inherit and things. And then, just how that affects things for then who's trying to grow food beyond just a way to feed themselves, and I think that in the pandemic, like you're saying, there's been all these land grabs. And I think, if anything, like what I always appreciate about working with other farmers is like you do have this more collective mindedness. And what we didn't see with a lot of like at least the small farms and like peers and people who inspire me is like that sort of individualist survival narrative, like it's not being a doomsday prepper and having your own individual bunker and all of these things. It was like really focused on trying to make sure that, that all of us kind of get by. And I think that that's what was so hard, is to see like such a spectrum of ways that people respond to perceived and very real crisis and scarcity. And for some people who this is the first time that their sense of well-being has been disrupted in that way. Like, I think it was fairly alarming. Like, I think because of working with Kitazawa, like just seeing the toll it took on the seed industry. And while, seed companies made a lot of money last year, it also just like meant something in terms of just like the seed that can be supplied through the next couple years. It meant shortages just from the growers' end of it. And it was just sort of alarming to kind of see that some of what was driving it was some of the like scarier parts of what happens if there's the fire in the crowded movie theater,
Yeah. That's an interesting way of putting it. I'm wondering also, like you touched on, there's so many things you and I can go on for hours on. You touched on, seeds and the seed, like you work with Kitazawa. A lot of growers this spring or this winter were kind of surprised to see so many seeds selling out so quickly. Like, do you have any insight on that, on what was happening, in this year with more and more seeds selling out really early? Was that because of those seeds sort of shortages from last year? Like, what do you have any thoughts or insight on that?
I do think that in some ways, like from what I've heard from other folks in the seed world, is that, there were some shortages just because it really came as such a shock last year. And I think people like were just responding in real time with what they had. And then you're just sort of looking at things at the end of the year and realizing, like, oh, wow, the seed that we thought was going to last for a couple years, like, is gone. And just like certain crops, like to replenish that takes a lot longer, or how much of a seed lot can be grown. And so I think some of that definitely happened. I think this year people wanted to pump the brakes a little bit and try to just figure out, not wanting farmers to necessarily be left in a lurch. So I know a lot of people just really paused ordering to just, figure out their systems, or just try to prioritize people who have been, who are kind of commercial growers and things. So I think some of that has just been, I think there are definitely seed shortages for a lot of different crops. But then some of it, I think too, is just like companies trying to, just figure out how to kind of, if this is going to be the situation again, it's just a lot of planning to figure out like what you have, who's growing what, at what scale are they growing it. And then, even for me, I'm on such a tiny scale, just like packing seed packets at my house. But it just gets to the point where like I would drop off an order at Kitazawa, and by the time I left their office, they were handing me an invoice for like the next order. And I think like it was exciting because I was like, oh, I really want these seeds to get out there. But at the same time, like I had to really pause, even just for myself, to just look at things and being like, okay, well, if this is going to be the case, like, and also just having my own production challenges, it's like having to figure out how much do I need to be setting inside? How much is like just insurance for my own farm? Like, how am I creating a buffer for potential crop failure and things like that? So I think when you're managing lots of different farm contracts and lots of different varieties in your catalog, doing all of those calculations is pretty enormous. So it's been interesting. I think with Kitazawa, what was interesting too is like just a lot of people, I think just this past year, like were trying to capitalize, and they'd say that a lot of people were buying bulk seed, but they could tell they were just like repacking it and just reselling it on Amazon. Like,
oh, wow,
I can't believe there's been this like, this kind of just strange thing happening. And at first, like I had misunderstood, and I thought, oh, people are starting more of like their own like small seed companies, and I thought that's good, But then when they're like, no, they're just like buying bulk, repacking it, and then like basically making a profit just from putting it in a different envelope, and then it just becomes like more anonymous on something like Amazon. I'm like, wow, I can't believe that this is becoming a commodity that's being treated this way, I guess.
Yeah, that kind of blows my mind. Like I always struggle to put myself in the shoes of somebody who would capitalize on a crisis, but I mean, in that way, like that had never crossed my mind.
Yeah, I mean, it was very shocking to me too. I think the other thing to understand is like it's, so much of the seed industry is like such a global enterprise. And so I think like, especially when you're buying hybrid varieties, like the labor to produce a lot of hybrid seed when it requires like hand pollination and things, usually means that labor will be exported to a place where labor is cheaper. And I think it's the side that like, as organic farmers and people with like a lot of sort of idealism, like we don't necessarily want to think about that, but yeah, like because something's so fundamental to our growing, like oftentimes you pull the camera back and you're really entrenched in, just kind of this bigger global economic design where, where cheap labor is just being capitalized upon, and we're not looking at the conditions that people are living and working in. And, just asking questions like why some countries, like, this very skilled labor, like hand pollinating hybrid tomatoes is very, it requires like a lot of knowledge. It's like a very incredible skill set. But why that labor then is just to kind of like export for this like more multinational cause, is somewhat sad. But I think that that's part of why we see some disruption as well, is that a lot of the seed industry is really dependent on these bigger global supply chains, and certainly that experienced a ton of disruption as different countries, just were not importing or exporting, or, different communities in different areas were being impacted by COVID. So all of these regulatory things like just couldn't really keep up to how this crisis really evolved, and really took kind of the system by complete surprise in a lot of ways. So I think that everything is still trying to get its bearings, get its feet back under it. And so that'll be interesting to see like what changes. And I do hope that ultimately, I want to have more faith in the majority of people, that this crisis has brought out some goodness in just recognizing, like, if you recognize your own vulnerability, like hopefully, thinking about how scary that is, and wanting for less people to experience that terror.
Right. It's something that I'm thinking about is just I'm wondering how many farmers saw those seed shortages and kind of started thinking more about why they are or aren't saving more seed of their own or doing more seed breeding. Mm-hmm. I've tried to make seed breeding and seed saving kind of somewhat of a fixture on this podcast, at least like once every 6 weeks or so, have somebody on talk about seeds, because I think that it's extremely important. It's extremely important for the ecology, like just developing seed that makes sense for your area, and for regional considerations and all of those things. But then, also just that ability to have that a little bit of safety, which I think also makes me think about the collaborative thing. Like, I have the capacity to think about growing the crops and selling them at market. I need somebody else that has can add a little bit of capacity to think about saving more of our own seed and developing seed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, you want to just kind of, I think like as individual small farmers, like a lot of times you're just like the sole like operator of the farm. And like I think I would rather be collaborative and work with people that are really good at what they do than try to be a sort of jack of all trades, which I think you get really used to, But I know just from like, my very limited ability with certain skills that are valuable on a farm, like whether that's as a tractor mechanic or a woodworker, like you can get by, but it just sort of, yeah, just the long-term resilience would be much better if there was that sort of community support. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, it would be great because then it could free up your mind to not have to, just wear all of these millions of different hats that are possible at any given time. But I do hope, that people think about just even one seed project that they could do on the farm, or really think like, what's really critical to their farming operation that, if we start seeing more regular interruptions in like these various supply chains, like what will happen. I think a lot of what drew me to exploring natural farming and things was just understanding, like, in a lot of ways, like, I don't want a certain type of global order to continue to perpetuate, especially when it comes to like how we maintain fertility on the farm. And so it's just sort of preparing for that in a lot of ways, to just say, like, I don't want communities to exist solely for like these extractive purposes, and that their fertility is like shipped all over the world. So I do think, seed is a really important part of that equation, and it's gotten to be fairly opaque as an industry. And so I think everybody now knows and maybe even misunderstands a little around like GMOs and things like that. But some of the other parts, especially about labor and seed contracts and just the economy around it, let alone like kind of lots of ethical dilemmas to unpack. Like I think it just sort of, there's just a lot that I think would be really shocking for small scale organic farmers to think about what the seed that they're buying is necessarily tied to at times.
Can you give us can you open up that opaqueness a little bit and give us a glimpse? Like, what do you think the average farmer probably doesn't realize that would be kind of significant in terms of seeds and the market?
I mean, I think for me, some of it is just about, the thing that surprised me was like learning some from breeders, especially around, things like hybrid tomatoes and, things that require a certain amount of like detailed hand labor, that is mostly going to happen in Costa Rica, Vietnam, or Thailand, just because the price of labor is just pennies to the dollar, basically. And if you were to do that in the U.S., it would probably happen in California. California's minimum wage, like $15 an hour. And I think even as someone who had been working in the seed industry, had worked for a tomato breeder, like that was so disappointing to find out, like to just be like, wow, this is just something. It doesn't matter if the seed is organic, if whatever, like just the nature of what it takes to produce a hybrid seed is that intensive, and that results in the need for this really exploited labor force. And just thinking about the export of those jobs and just the plight of a lot of small scale farmers, I think just only being able to speak really from like knowing and feeling very connected to farmers in Korea, but like what that means just for peasants globally in terms of whether it's like fresh market trade and neoliberalism, like putting their land to use to mostly be exported for other people's use. The import of lots of cheap food, like just all these things that affect regional self-sufficiency and food security in these areas. Like, so as much as we saw these disruptions in the U.S., like I think in some ways, like in other places where there is more regional self-sufficiency, like you're going to just weather it a lot better. And when you're tied to all of these other things and you're coming into these legacies of weird economic restructuring and things, that means cheap food has always flooded the country, and it's meant small farmers can't hold on to their land. It just becomes this sort of kind of nefarious spider web that's very hard to untangle, because you also just see like, that certain economic growth is possible because of this, but it definitely comes at this steep price. And I think that disruptions like a pandemic just point out the fact that you've been shortchanged, like it's been fine for sort of short-term immediate growth for the type of capitalism we're living within. But then in the long term, it just means some communities just cannot weather these disasters in the same way, whether it's a pandemic or just the ongoing onslaught of natural disasters that everywhere is facing right now.
Right. Yeah, that is really fascinating. The hybrid seed thing, that certainly was not something I was aware of. I don't even know what I envisioned, but that really is enlightening.
Hey, you all, just jumping in real quick to get a word from our sponsors like Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil makes NOP-compliant living potting soils in Cleveland, Ohio with food scraps they haul and compost themselves. Each batch of soil is tested against the competitors and the results are in. Plants vote for Tilth Soil. To learn more about their full line of products, please visit www.tilthsoil.com. This show is also brought to you by you, the patrons. Patreon is the lifeblood of our work, and we appreciate each and every one of you so much for making a small contribution every month. Even if you can only hang for a few months or, during the growing season or whatever, we sincerely appreciate it. Even if it's not Patreon and you want to go the Venmo route and kick us a few dollars to @NoTillGrowers, we appreciate that as well. Or maybe you have some crypto and you're like, I dig this no-dig stuff. I could kick them a sliver of Bitcoin or whatever. You can do that as well at notillgrowers.com/support. But if you go the Patreon route at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to Kirsten Taylor, Ojai Roots, Rimmel Greenhouse Systems, Scott Snodgrass, Jody Miller, Shane and Emma of Aslan Organics, Travis and Heidi of Arcadia Acres, Jacob Arthur, Fiona and Donnie of Firefly Farm, Jean-Martin Fortier, and Yannick LaPlante. Big thanks to everyone who supports our show, even if it's just a share on your favorite social media platform. We appreciate all of that. So thank you so much. All right. Back to Kristyn.
So I'm just curious, kind of in that vein, what level of disservice, if any, I guess it's possible there isn't a big one, but do you think what level of disservice do you think we're doing to ourselves by not buying more regionally adapted seeds for our farms? Do you think there's a big yield loss? Do you think there's a big quality loss?
That's a good question.
Beyond just the ethical, beyond just the ethical issues of buying, perhaps hybrid seeds like that.
Yeah. I think this actually is a good thing that you bring up, and it's a little hard to parse out because I do see more emphasis on regional seed companies, and it's hard because there are so many really great small seed companies that are really regionally focused and doing a lot of their own trials and adapting varieties for the region. And then there are small regional seed companies that are focused on their local economy, but are still, you're contracting seed from all over the place. And so, I think there's a lot to understand within it. I do think, if you have just the more ability we have to create this really nuanced regional seed system, it will just be all the better. And I think for those things also to just work with one another as well, because I do think that there's also just limitations. I think California honestly gets frowned upon a lot of times. I see a lot of kind of smack being talked about the fact that most seeds are grown in the Central Valley. And where I live, we've got over 200 seed campuses within 10 miles of us, basically.
Wow.
And so I think that it's true that that's really problematic. But some seed too, there's a difference between the development of a variety and stress testing it for all of these different conditions, whether it's different pathogens or climatic conditions. So I think it's very useful to, it's just that balance of the stress that you're providing, but then also, I do think it makes sense to be collaborative in our approach. And sometimes, I do think certain regions, you can just grow really high quality seed. So I do think that there's a utility, and there's a reason why the seed industry is really consolidated in places like where I am, because of just how dry it is and how you really can control kind of all of these factors, at least for the time being. And there's also just a lot of requirements too in terms of day length sensitivity. Like I used to live in the Northwest and I always thought I'd return there, but so many of the crops I love, like I just legitimately can't grow seed up there. Like I have these very certain requirements. So I do think that it is extremely important. And there's also just, still going to be a need, I think, especially when you look at kind of cultural diversity and other issues with who is guiding like our seed breeding and seed improvement and seed preservation practices. Again, I think the theme of this talk is quickly becoming like collaboration is just really key. Because I do think, we should be adapting it. And I love thinking about the seeds that I'm growing here. Like you may not think because of the climate in Kentucky is so different, the type of summer you experience, but I love thinking about sending you seeds. And even if my seeds are equipped to deal with like a completely different type of, climate and set of conditions, like it could be great to just work together so that, you have like these different varieties that are suited for more humidity and moisture in the summer and all the different things that you face. I think the being regional is very important. And it's also just good to kind of like always be having your own insurance as like seed keepers to, like, I just think of like all these plants as the same as we were talking about with being a parent. Like you want to equip them for every possible iteration of what could go wrong in the world. And you want them to thrive in whatever ways as possible. So to bolster that resilience, like I really do think, like it will just be really reliant on us. Just sharing resources and being really open in terms of, just kind of like this exchange and wanting to test things in different areas. But I do think, it also, I don't entirely think it makes sense the way like we just think that seed grown in California like is useless outside of California. Like in some ways it's grown and it is like a very good quality to use because there's just very little risk of just things that can happen in other types of climate. So all that to say, I think we need as many people and entities involved as possible. But I do think that there should still be some unity and working together within and across different regions because, I think each seed lot would just benefit from that.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking of it. I almost like think about my question in trying to reduce it down to specific regions, and maybe by doing so, if we did that, we limit the genetic potential of those seeds to really, like you said, have them exposed to as a great diversity of situations so they're better able to handle themselves down the line.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think because it's, again, just saying like we can think about the conditions and having crops that are able to thrive in those conditions. And then also just like where the physical seed is grown sometimes can be different. So like if I think, about friends in the Northwest, and wanting them to grow something like perilla, which is just challenging as a seed crop for them to grow because of day length requirements, I can constantly send them trial seeds and send them different lines of seeds. And they could see and they could give feedback, this variety like does pretty well for the duration of our season or for our uses. And I can grow the seed for them, but based on that feedback. So just saying there's more ways to kind of exchange and to not necessarily just default to conflating like crops that are tested and trialed to thrive in a variety of conditions, but then the seed is grown somewhere else. Like I actually think that can be okay. But again, like to think of it in like a bigger conversation around like, what really is working and how seed growers and farmers can kind of just like be in a more open dialogue about like what the needs are and how to best be responsive to those needs. And then, just have more of that sort of spirit of sharing, and seeds genuinely being, returned to like its place within the sort of agricultural commons, and returned to like having these plants being really held in that sort of right relationship. I think would be kind of the ultimate goals.
Yeah, that's great. Can you catch us up a little bit on second generation? I checked earlier, and it seems like you've added some cool new seeds to that catalog. Can you, well, first, not everyone may be familiar with it. Can you tell us what second generation seeds is, and then talk about some of the new additions?
Yeah, definitely. So second generation is the seed line that I got to start within Kitazawa, just to have something within the company that was really focused on small scale growers and heirloom seeds and their stories. And just thinking like the significance of Kitazawa being, 104 years old, all the stories that it's held, and wanting to just create like a really, just a place to capture a lot of that information beyond the physical seed. And so we just started with offering, mostly people were interested in having Korean chili peppers available. And then we've just grown it. And, so far it's only mostly crops that are, Korean heritage crops, perilla, peppers, cucumbers, soybeans. But we also, added this type of, it's called sagwachane, which is apple melon in Korean. And, that's just hands down one of my favorite crops. It's like, Korean melons are generally just rather crunchy, and it's sort of a cross in what you would expect between a cucumber and a melon. They do have a lot of sweetness, but they're a little less sweet, and part of that is also because they were used in like fermented and preserved for the winter. So there's low sugar content actually like helps with it not just fermenting too quickly or getting too mushy. And melons are just, it's just sort of what I love about second generation is like each crop does provide this sort of wormhole where you get to really talk about history. You get to talk about just the ways of, just the beauty of how people have related to plants, and just have really shaped biodiversity. And I think that's what I'm most excited about, is just acknowledging, we've been on this trajectory of really winnowing out a lot of our biodiversity very quickly. And I think that, this project and what we're trying to do is like a response to that, to just think what gave us that biodiversity is like this interesting, just distinct sort of preferences that developed across different people and places, and just how that had a bearing on how plants responded to be in relationship with that. And so I think that that's what we're just trying to do again, is preserve some of the varieties that have been valuable to our different communities in the Asian diaspora. And then also just think about engaging Asian American communities to think about seeds for the future, and just how we have conversations and try to encourage everybody to feel invested in that seed system, because everybody likes to eat. And that should immediately like bring your mind to thinking about all of these things, even if you don't immediately go there. And we're shifting, to a more collective model. And so there are other growers. We formed this growers collaborative to kind of, turn second generation into something that just can just continually bring in and work to support Asian communities to just really think about, preserve the stories that are important to us, and then how that relates to just plant biology. So there's Scott Chang Fleeman from Shaoshan Farm is involved now, and Ari Delania from Kamayan Farm up in Carnation, Washington is involved, and Kelly Matsushita Sang, who leads the CASFIS, the agroecology program at UC Santa Cruz. And it's just definitely the project I love. I mean, I think when I was younger and managing another farm and living alone in a trailer, I read the book Ishmael, I think by Daniel Quinn. And
great classic. Yeah.
I mean, I think I was, in my mid to late 20s and just really feeling like, oh, I'm going to be farming for the rest of my life. And I read that book and it put me into a little existential tailspin, because part of what it talks about is essentially agriculture being the cornerstone of how we developed, sort of hierarchical systems. And certainly there are modes of thought that think that, the domestication of plants has led us into this, hell realm that we now reside in permanently. And the idea that agriculture is about domination. And I think at that age, I really felt very sad thinking about that. This is what I've done. This is what I feel like I'm, planning to do with my life. And now I'm really contemplating, am I evil? And I think seed stewardship has been a way out of that, out of that existential angst to a certain extent, because, just seeing all of these plants, seeing the way people respond to them, and then seeing the way that the Korean perilla is so iconic to Korean Americans. And when you research and try to think of the sort of story about it from a genetic level and the morphology of it, and realize it's a tetraploid and not a diploid, which basically should suggest to you that there is some sort of mutation of wild species that grow all throughout East Asia that was noticed and then stabilized. There's a beauty in that. And I think that speaks to something that's not about dominion. It's about, a mutual sort of taming of people and these plant species. And so I think that, fortunately, I think having this love and getting to learn so much from seeds has, it just sort of points out, in all these realms, what are the narratives that you've grown up with? What are the narratives that we're really, bogged down by in our society? And I think that plants speak very eloquently to the fact that those are all constructs. And a lot of this has existed because of just the designs of our species. But I think being led into these other stories is really quite profound, to see something that's not just an alternative, but just saying that the way that we have known how to organize ourselves as a society, has so many shortcomings, and so many other species, do not opt to organize that way. So I think it's just knowing how personally impactful it's been on every level, from, my relationship to my lineage and to my community, and my community, how it affects, how these stories help shape and guide healthier eating, because of just the crops are then tied to all of these different things. I just think we should all be defaulting to plants for guidance, because there's way more wisdom there than what's happening, coming down from our species. And so, we're starting a program too called Seed Stewards. And that is bringing together other BIPOC farmers and trying to think about ways, we've kind of talked about through this conversation, what are ways that more fresh market, small scale farmers can be incentivized and supported to do seed projects on their own farm and develop a seed program. So in thinking through that, what we wanted to create was essentially something that could function as a small fellowship of sorts, where we bring together 6 farmers as a cohort, and we run an 8-month program. And part of the idea was, I piloted a small version of this last year with my CSA, because I just felt like sometimes in what's called participatory breeding in the seed industry, we involve different people at different points, and we mostly get sort of evaluation information. So people weigh in on flavor and preferences and textures, shape, blah, blah, blah. And that's reconciled a lot of times with more professional breeders that just synthesize some of that information, right? And so we've seen lots of great things that involve other partners. There's Culinary Breeding Network up in the Northwest, and they've just done so much to kind of bring other parts of this conversation to the table about, breeding not happening behind these closed doors or not being solely just professionalized, and how culinary traits should factor into it when a lot of times like breeding has maybe centered other things. But to me, I also just felt like, well, that a lot of times like the things I participated in like kind of function as like almost like a consumer focus group where we take into account like those preferences to better understand like our market. And like, that's good, but just wanted to shift that a little bit so that things also existed in a more decentralized way, or just knowing how meaningful it could be for people to have this entry point. And you're a CSA member, you're getting a box of produce each week from me. So what would it look like for those conversations to just be more dynamic, and for us to like supply a little bit of the botanic information, and to just say like, this is the process by which most of our crop varieties and domesticated crops have come into existence, is by that give and take between farmers and eaters. And so we just convened a cohort of Korean, Vietnamese, and Filipino families, and each box has a theme throughout the season. And we like build a very nerdy curriculum where we do a virtual potluck, and that potluck includes like a class at the beginning where, so let's say 1 month we focus on summer squash, and I highlighted, I'm working on breeding a variety of Korean ahobak, which is a Cucurbita machata, but eaten as a summer squash. And so it's just a good example. Koreans think, oh, ahobak, Korean zucchini is just, it's just way better than zucchini, because obviously Koreans made it, and it's just, you know, far superior in terms of its eating quality. And while I appreciate the nationalist sentiment of that, you know, the reality is it's so different in terms of flavor and texture, because that species is just very different from Cucurbita pepo, which is a lot of the zucchini varieties you eat, just in terms of like starch and the way like different nutrients are converted. So I think, you know, like for people, if you've eaten like an immature butternut squash, you know, it has a really different feeling. And so we wanted to just break down some of that, like, oh, well, yeah, maybe you prefer this and you prefer it for all the ways that Koreans use this type of summer squash. But this is kind of why, and getting to like illuminate a little bit of the backdrop of genetics and, and the sort of evolution of these crops. And so it wants to be this give and take. And then also the CSA members are asked to do like community or family interviews. So each crop, each box they get, they choose a crop within it. And the kids from the families have to find someone to interview that has a relationship with it and can contextualize it within a cultural context to understand, you know, why is this crop so significant to your community? Or, you know, is this a beloved thing, and why? How do you use it? How do you describe the flavor? What's important to you? So we're trying to get some, you know, develop some language collectively around like even how we start to talk about and describe the experience of food, and then translate that to how that affects like being able to identify traits that become valuable for a farmer to know. And we can merge that then and share back, well, this is like the traits I'm looking for in the field. I'm breeding ahobak to be drought tolerant, and I'm making these interspecies crosses because I want something that has the eating quality of Cucurbita machata, but in the plant architecture of Cucurbita pepo, because it's more open, it is more compact, all of these things. So it's just about this idea that we want to include all of these perspectives, like what it means to eat it, what are the stories, what are the things that connect it to like our heart and spirit, along with just what's going to equip these plants for increased survival and resilience in the future. So that was by far, you know, the highlight of last year, because it just, even though so many of these kids are dealing with like virtual everything and parents are looking at screens more than ever, people just got so engaged, and it felt like it transcended the screen and felt like there was more substantive community building. And to me, like the important parts that it hit on was also, you know, when everyone pivoted to CSA last year, it's really, to me, like, I'm on your show, you've talked about it a lot, and lots of your guests have talked about it. I think probably when you interviewed 10 Mothers Farm, they were the ones that said, oh, CSA is like, we're going to stand by this. This is how we've made it work. But I remember that episode because it stood in contrast to what I felt and what a lot of other small farmers felt, which is it's a beast. It's a logistics bear. And so when everyone had to pivot last year to it, to me, I was a little concerned, like, we're doing this to just respond and survive. In the long term, is this where we want to be as small scale farmers? And I know for me too, with doing seed production and having that be pretty central, I grow less amount of crops and more volume because of like all the breeding stuff and just like minimum population and things like that. So CSA wasn't like super ideal for me because I can't offer everyone a box where every few weeks it rotates and you have 12 different things at any given time. So we also wanted to make something that was sort of adaptive so I can give more volume of less things because we're focusing on a theme each month. But then highlight, actually, there's a ton of diversity within that and have people be able to have enough of a crop so that they can really experiment. So, you know, you could prepare, you know, like a traditional dish with the summer squash you have, and then you're hearing from another family with a different background, like how it's used, you know, how their grandma taught them how to use it. And so just that exchange has been really exciting. And the other exciting part was that families, the main feedback was that things that would be a hard sell at times, like, or people who've participated in CSAs before, like if their kids didn't like it, most times they didn't have the energy to like really fight them about it. So they're like, we honestly would compost some of this stuff. But because it's sort of wrapped in all of these other narratives and kids are getting to hear other kids talk about their excitement for it, to me, I was like, if you've never tried something or you sort of don't like something at first blush, if you hear someone else talk about it and they love it, like you're going to give it a second, a third, fourth chance, and you'll probably just love it a little bit more each time because you'll hear their voice in your head telling you what they love about it, or it's attached to, you know, a personal story, and people just sharing that, you know, affects the experience of eating. And so lots of parents just said, my kid is begging me for bitter melon now. Like I never thought I'd see the day, but we ran out of bitter melon from your box. So they're asking for us to go out and buy more. Like, can I just get some extra in the next box? And to me, I was like, if I die now, I will feel like I accomplished something to have like 6-year-olds basically be doubling down on bitter melon. But again, it's just because it's sort of like, you know, oh, they're just hearing, it's like this positive form of peer pressure, I think, where, you know, some of those families are just so excited and we're like, oh, great, bitter melon month is here. I'm so stoked. I mean, we did a little homework exercise called like Dream Pumpkin, where I made flashcards of all different pumpkin varieties, and we had them assess like shape, color, skin thickness, flavor, and texture of flesh. We just said, mix any of these two pumpkins and tell me what traits you want from each of them, and then what your resultant pumpkin would look like and what you would cook with it. And we had one little girl say, my pumpkin is pink and it's the size of a lemon. I said, okay, what does it taste like? She said, oh, it's really bitter. And I was like, okay, never in my life have I heard someone say, you know what, I want to breed a winter squash that's just like insanely bitter. So to me, it's been really exciting to think, yeah, again, seeds being this entry point, not just for farmers, but just in the broader kind of community, and thinking about public health discourse too, where a lot of communities feel like talked down to sometimes about what is healthy eating or what a healthy plate of food looks like. And the way we frame public health disparities of like higher rates of diabetes and other types of disease in our communities. And I just think there's so much opportunity through like having this type of engagement to address and reprogram and reframe some of those stories of just saying, actually, it's more of our birthright to live healthy. Like all of our ancestors knew how to do this. Like, look at the crops we all came up with. Look at the crops that like all of our ancestors bred. So to feel plugged back into that story and feel more like you're returning to something that is the much older story than what you've been told. I think, again, it's just this unique opportunity that the perspective of a seed, this perspective of all of these plants as they've evolved, can share with us. So I'm excited. Our cohort this year is just going to be amazing, and it's just going to bring together all of the farmers' CSAs into like a bigger connected network, sharing all of that information. And each farmer is going to take a month to highlight, a crop of their choice. So I think, that's the thing I'm definitely looking forward to most this year, and thinking that all of that excitement just means accelerating and amplifying those outcomes, like outcomes in terms of how people eat and their excitement and their connection to their farmer and the farmer's own connection to like these plants. And I think when you talked about like what's it going to take for farmers to think about how to do these seed projects, like I think when it's just driven by that pure, that just like really pure love, it just reframes things. Like you just stop thinking about, you find a way to make it work. Like I could do all the crop enterprise analysis, but at the end of the day, I don't even bother doing something like that for like the seed crops that I love the most, because I don't want to know if it doesn't pencil out, honestly, because it wouldn't really change a thing that I was doing,
Right. I mean, there's another value there that had, may not be monetary, but it is, there's a certain value there that you cherish. And I think that should always be appreciated. I also like the CSA model for a number of reasons. And one you didn't really, or you mentioned, but that really stuck out to me was the cultural sort of preservation element of it. And that, you have these families who the kids now have to go and speak with somebody who actually knows what that vegetable is, or fruit, and maybe never would have done that. Or that person probably, in some cases probably hasn't thought about that fruit or that vegetable in a long time. And I think that's it's like I always think about the values that we put in our CSA baskets or in our food that are not food. And that's one of them to me. Like that's a really special one.
Oh, definitely. And I think it just is those things, like, I think as food that it gets introduced to the West, or like the Western paradigm, for example, like as a superfood, sometimes like when there aren't those historic perspectives or the palates that like appreciate like sour and bitter and these strong flavors, a lot of spice, we end up like, you don't know what else gets winnowed out in an attempt to like minimize like flavor profiles that aren't as sort of popular outside of those communities. So especially with bitterness, like, bitter melon is such a medicinal plant. If we acknowledge and want the medicinal properties, but we're trying to say like, make it more palatable because a lot of people don't like bitter flavor, like you just don't know all the sort of interesting metabolic pathways that one outward facing feel to us like flavor, but are also representative of all of these interesting gene bundles that probably are making it have such potent medicinal value or make it so sort of resilient in the field. Like there's just ways that things are attached. And so I think flavor as an entry point is a good way to talk about those other things. And, to just say if we allow for that view of what's delicious or attractive or useful to be sort of defaulting to the sort of hegemonic worldview we're in, which just will skew towards a Eurocentric preference, even if we preserve those crops because they start being popular, like we just might lose some of those traits if the stewardship doesn't like continue to reflect back on that. And again, it's not saying like it needs to stay one way, but to me, like as someone that is Korean but didn't grow up in Korean culture, like I feel that both as someone, as a Korean American and as an outsider, because I felt like it was my responsibility to have that input, because the greatest joy to me is bringing these crops that are so sentimental to people, but especially to like Korean elders. I want to continue to bring them crops that to them feels recognizable in some way. So even if I'm adapting or breeding for X, Y, and Z on my farm, like I want to think, what's the tether that when they taste it will still always feel recognizable to them? even if it's allowed to change. And if we do new varieties, how do we also like include other people's palates in that? And I just think just getting more people excited about all of these processes and realizing how engaging it can be is, and just, like beginning to bridge like science and just like the pure experiential joy of eating delicious food, is the most exciting part to me. And we're going to get to work with UC Davis is Charlie Brummer, who's their head of like the plant sciences and plant breeding, is going to work on a project with us and with their Asian studies department to kind of try to bring together this proof of concept of just, these public land grant universities, like having their breeding programs represent more diverse communities. And from what I've heard from a lot of public breeders, it's like, you're just getting funding from USDA, you're finding your own grants. Like if this feels like what gets called just like niche populations and things, or just like specialty niche crops, oftentimes there's not the incentive for them to want to breed for things that they think are just only significant to a certain community. But to UC Davis's credit and, to Charlie and Katharina from the Stephen Farm, like they've just done an incredible job to say, no, this is really valuable. And as a public university, we need to be accountable to everybody. And so just, it's incredibly exciting to me to see that come to fruition, to say we're bringing together cultural studies and plant sciences and finding a place for those things to meet and understand how they need each other, rather than thinking of cultural studies as, just more liberal arts or like soft social science, and then physical science is more rigorous and serious. But, those things really need to inform each other.
That's great. Well, Kristyn Leach, I feel like we could talk for hours. Thank you so much for your time. This has been such a blast.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's always, great to catch up. And I appreciate too, just like all the nuggets of wisdom that I feel like I can tap you for, especially as a new parent. So thank you for everything you've shared.
Absolutely. Anytime. Absolutely anytime.
All right. If you enjoyed that episode, make sure to follow Kristyn on Instagram and all the places. I will hook it up with links in the show notes. Also, go check out her line of seeds from Kitazawa. It's called Second Generation. I'll put that link in there too. If you have enjoyed this season and appreciate our work, please go to no-tillgrowers.com/support or to patreon.com/no-tillgrowers and consider kicking in a few bucks. Also, make sure you are subscribed to all the things we do. No-Till Flowers with Jenny Love, the Winter Growers podcast with Clara Coleman, Growers Live with Josh Satin, which is every other Tuesday on YouTube. I will be there this upcoming Tuesday, which would be May 11th, 2021. Also, make sure to keep an eye out for the Collaborative Farming podcast with Jackson Roulette. That will be out in a few weeks. And we have one more big treat coming later this summer, but that will pop up on this feed. So you'll get it. With that in mind, make sure you're subscribed to this podcast wherever you are getting it and leave a review. But this week, all reviews must be a little bit sad that the season is over, but also maybe just a little bit happy for me that I can focus on getting my farm up and running, and also a little bit sad again too, because, I'll miss you all too. Huge thanks, as always, to Jackson Roulette and Josh Satin. Thanks to Willie Bye Bye For Now Breeding for the theme music. Thank you times a million to my wife, Hannah Crabtree, for all of her help behind the scenes. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you again soon, I promise. Bye.
Yeah, I remember when our first was born, like the second I was able to catch him, like I got to be there, we had him at home and I got to catch the baby, and it was so much fun. Like leading up to that moment, I was like having this really great time. And then like, as soon as I caught the baby, like I could feel a chemical shift in my body, and I've never been the same human. And it's funny because the next baby, when he was born, we were having not trouble, but there was a moment when Hannah and I could both sense that the midwives were kind of like, we need this to move along. And I almost fainted. Like I've never felt so terrible, like genuinely had to sit down, could not stand. They were like, do you want to catch the baby? And I was like, I don't think I can.
Oh my God.
it went from me being like geeking out about my wife having, you know, like how amazing the things that she was able to do to being like, I'm going to pass out because I'm so terrified right now for the next one.